Excuse me. Okay. How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Artisans of Steel podcast. So, this is an interview series that I'm starting, talking with some of the best knife makers I know of in the world. And today's guest is Mr. Peter Swarz-Burt. He specializes in swords, he makes great culinary knives. He is an expert when it comes to crucible steels, meaning like wootz, traditional Damascus. We'll get into that. We'll talk about all that stuff later. First, though, I want to give some love to the sponsors, and then we'll get Peter in here and we'll start chatting with him and we'll be answering some of your questions too. All right, so the first sponsor is Mr. Michael Poor. He's a Red Dragon Forge on Instagram. He's also a fellow Washingtonian. He's based out of Port Townsend, Washington, and he makes anything from Japanese katanas to culinary knives and everything between. He's a good person to watch, so go check him out on Instagram at Red Dragon Forge. The next person is Mr. Randy Estep. He is the Scotch Explorer on Instagram, so go check him out and go follow his Scotchcapades. That was kind of hard to say. Try saying that 3 times fast. All right, the next one is Mr. Eric McWright of McWright Handmade on Instagram. He's super talented guy. His focus is more on hunters and bowies, but he has been dabbling in chef's knives and culinary knives, and he's doing some really great work. So he's definitely going to be a guy to watch when it comes to chef's knives. Go check him out as well. I'm probably going to say check him out to everybody, so please forgive me. Next is Mr. Russell Tinsley. In the Discord, he is he is can't make knives. He's new to knife making, so he's figuring this out. He is a brewer by day. His brewery is Ouzelfinch, based out of Virginia, and they specialize. I think they brew all kinds of stuff, but they do a lot of sours that they're very well known for. So go check them out at their. Go look for their beers at your local beer market. If they don't got them, put a request in, because some tasty stuff. The next sponsor is Maritime Knife Supply. They're a knife making supplier out of Atlantic Canada. They got everything from hand tools, castable refractory, abrasives, grinders, everything you need as a knife makers. They are in Canada, and so for all the Canadian Patreon supporters, they're a great resource for you for getting what you need to make your knife. So go check them out at maritimeknifesupply.com. Our next sponsor is Mr. Aidan McKinnon. He's the founder and operator of Cutthroat Australia. They specialize in culinary knives. They do all kinds of really cool collaborations with chefs and influencers and people in the culinary field. And they make some really great stuff. He's doing some really innovative and interesting things where, like, he's casting. He's doing like laser cutout tangs with like little designs and stuff on them, and then he's casting the handle material around that tang. That's pretty interesting. It's pretty cool. So go check him out. It's Cutthroat Australia on Instagram. Next we have Mr. Gabe Fletcher, who is another maker who has a brewing problem, who is actually a professional brewer of Alaska, or sorry, not Alaska, up in Alaska at Anchorage Brewing, Anchorage Brewing Company on Instagram. They make Gabe sent a sample pack of some of the work they do, and they are literally some of the best beers I've ever tasted in my life. So again, go to your beer market, get some Anchorage beer, Anchorage Brewing beer, and if they don't carry it, put a request in. They'll take care of you. And let's see, we got Tony Sasma, who is another maker. Sorry, this thing's not working for me right now. Who is another maker based out of, here he is. He's in Lake in the Hills, Illinois. He also specializes in culinary knives. He's doing some really great Damascus too, by the way. He's forging integrals, and he's working with some really crazy handle material. I'm just looking at it right here, right now. And he's doing some solid work. So go check him out on Instagram at TNT Forge. And finally, and then we also got Kari Rakkonen. Kari Rakkonen. So Kari is also another fellow Washingtonian. He is based out of Shelton, Washington. He runs a dojo. He is a businessman, at heart, but he's also getting into knife making. He's been making knives. I think when we chatted last, he said that he's been making knives for about 4 or 5 years, and he's just looking to learn more, and he's here to support and give his love. And then finally, we got Mr. Josh Weston, Josh A. Weston on Instagram. He's a very talented maker. Actually, I don't know why I can't think of where Josh is from right now. But right now he's down in Arizona, just outside of Phoenix at the Arizona Renaissance Festival. But he was also a Fortune Fire competitor, just like myself. He's super creative. He comes from a graphic arts background. Very talented guy, very creative. He's been doing some really cool collaborations. And so you got to go check him out on Instagram at Josh A. Weston. So without further ado, we're going to pull Mr. Peter Swarz-Burt into the conversation. Hello. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Mareko?
I'm doing good. It's a mouthful to get through all the sponsors. I'm so thankful for them, but that's a lot.
Yeah,
So,
if you
I'll
keep
get better
getting
at
more,
it. This
if
is
you
only
get
the second
more,
time.
you'll have to cut them down to be like, okay, so I'm just gonna do your Instagram or your Discord or whatever it is, and say go check them out. Yeah,
A
and
1,000 times.
1,000 times exactly.
Yeah.
It'll be perfect.
Okay.
Or
So
you'll.
oh, sorry. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, or you'll have to have like a prequel to each episode in which you start off with your sponsors.
That's
Make it
actually,
entertaining though, so that people listen. That's the
yeah,
trick.
that's very, very good call. All right. So I first met you, Peter, after, let's see, I competed on Fortune Fire for the first time in 2015. And I think it was 2016 at Blade Show is
Yep.
where I met you, because you shared a shop with my fellow competitor, Jamie Lundell.
Yep.
And I came and hung out, and or I guess we road tripped back from Atlanta, Georgia, all the way back up to Connecticut. And
uh-huh. Yeah.
yeah, that was a
that
lot.
that ill-fated road trip.
Yeah, and
Good thing you were sleeping.
yeah, good thing I'm good. I'm a good car collectic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I worked in the shop for, I think I was there for a week or something like that. And I don't even think Jamie and I really accomplished much, but I feel like you were a bit annoyed. Honestly, I think at first, because I can sometimes be a bit much. And I think we were saying bro and dude like all the time, jokingly.
Uh,
Just be and I
yes.
feel like you had enough. You had enough of it after the first couple hours, and I was there for a week.
I mean, I think that a big part of that is actually comes down. Probably it was a combination of you and Jamie, but it really comes down to Jamie is a person who gets very excited about things, and he's especially then. Now, he's got a kid. He's a whole different person now. But
Yeah, he's just all
he
worn
was.
out. He's tired all the
Yeah,
time.
exactly. got to really schedule his days because you've only got so much energy.
Yep.
You got to put it where it's important. But he's very good at, or especially was very good at no plan, and if there was a plan, he wasn't going to tell anybody what the plan was. So it made it trickier. I was excited to have you there. But it was definitely it was a little hard to work around just because
Not the
Jamie
greatest
wanted
first
to do
impression.
well. Jamie wanted to do everything in that
Right.
week. He wanted
Yeah.
to cover every single possible thing
We
that
tried
could
to do
get done.
Mocha Man. Tried to do, and you helped steer us in a good direction. You're like, he's here because he's very good at making Damascus. So why don't you just focus on that
Yeah,
and cut back on bros?
yeah. Fewer bros. Yeah. Well, and this was the part that actually got me about that. You weren't saying bro. It was all brah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, brah.
Oh
And I was just like, oh Jesus, you're gonna kill me. Brah.
yeah. I think that was 8 years ago. No, wait, 6 years ago
I mean,
now.
It's been a while. Let's just go with
Still
a
remember it.
while.
It's been
It's
a
been a bit.
while. And then, so yeah, all right. So that was your first impression of me, and then I got into kind of a tough situation where I had to figure out what I was doing. I was losing my shop space back here in Washington, and we were trying to figure out. My wife and I were newly married, and trying to decide, what we were doing, and we could have probably made something work around here, but I felt like there were great opportunities other places, and when I had left, because you guys had a shopmate, Michael, um, Coffee. There he is. I
Right.
was like, I
Yep.
I don't
Michael
remember his name.
Coffey.
Fefe. And and
Michael. Michael.
and he was getting ready to leave the shop, and Jamie was like, you could always move to Connecticut and join the shop here. We got great stuff, and you guys did have a great setup. Um, and so when my wife and I were trying to figure out what the hell we're gonna do, I jokingly said, "Well, we could always move to Connecticut, and I could join Dragon's Breath Forge." And she was like, "Hmm, let me think about that."
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
she did a cost benefit analysis, honestly, and that so it cost wise, it would have been about the same as just staying, especially if we were looking at buying or something like that. But what tipped the scales was the opportunities of networking out there and connecting with all the other makers up in the Northeast, and being so close to New York. And I had some clients in New York, and connections there, as well as learning from you guys, especially you with your crucible steels. And you guys do so much other stuff, like especially around the swords and all that, that I do
Right.
not do. And so I thought there was a great opportunity to learn out there. And so we took the jump and we moved out. And I mean, honestly, after we first met that first time around, I was like, oh my God, I think Peter hates me. But honestly, I was surprised at how well we got along, and uh, Jamie and I are close, but I think honestly, like you and I are closer, um, and we became very good friends, and
Yeah.
we we share a similar silly kind of sense of humor, but we also have really good discussions about metallurgy and wootz and Damascus and all that kind of stuff. Oh, got a cat on the lap.
Yeah. A little flyby.
All
Little
right.
flyby.
What cat was that?
Well, so we're
Oh,
fostering
foster
a
kitty.
couple of yeah,
Yeah,
fostering a couple kittens. Big kitten at this point, but
yeah.
yeah, he's very inquisitive
Sure, sure.
and
He's like, "Where's all
especially
that sad?"
inquisitive about keyboards. So we had to make sure that didn't get started.
That reminds me of the Sad Cat Diaries.
Yes.
I'm so tired, but nobody's currently typing.
Yeah. Um,
Okay, so that is how I met you, and,
yes.
or we met each other, but I would like to I don't know if you've had an opportunity like this, to kind of talk about your history, where you come from, how you got started in blacksmithing and then bladesmithing and so on and so forth, and how you
Yep.
fell down the rabbit hole of wootz and all that jazz. So why don't you just
Yep.
start from being a zygote?
Yeah. So when I was this big, now I started becoming interested in blacksmithing. I guess when I was 15. I
Okay.
uh, I'd always been a little bit of a pyromaniac in some ways.
Okay.
As so many people are.
Sure.
Um, like when I was in, I guess probably like fourth grade. Uh, we lived at that point. We were living in Michigan, and there was a horse chestnut tree nearby. And horse chestnuts, of course, have all those little spikes on them. And
Sure.
I was already reading fantasy novels. And I was like, oh wow, this looks like a mace head. This is so cool. And then managed to convince my dad to help me make a plaster casting of it and then pour it in lead. So
Oh,
there for a while, I had a couple of lead horse chestnuts like on a rope that, you know, which of course is like the worst flail ever, because everything you hit, it just like
Boink,
it just
and it just sticks to it.
flattens.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
well,
right,
it,
'cause
it
lead.
just squishes because it's lead.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
But you know, and I was like making you know, at that stage I was like making wooden war hammers and things like that. All of
Okay.
our cans that needed to get recycled got flattened out of nothing. That was my job. Um, but then we moved to Maine, and my parents were building their house. They had this huge where they built. It was like all clay, and so there was this huge mound of clay from digging the foundation. And so I was like, "Oh, this is going to be great! I'll dig a hole in the side. I'm going to make this furnace thing." And so I started setting that up, and eventually, accidentally melted a pair of pliers in it, and it was
Oh,
like,
that's pretty
okay,
hot.
yeah, yeah, and that was probably, you know, and this we've now skipped forward a bunch, you know,
Yeah.
and you know, so this is now when I was 15 or so, and then you know, I rather than continuing to melt pliers, my dad pointed out that I could get things not quite as hot, and I could forge them. You know, rather than melting stuff, I could forge stuff, and so luckily our local dump was a place where they had a big scrap metal pile, and back then,
Oh, no.
you know, insurance was not what it was today, so I could actually go dig through it.
Right. You're
Um,
just 16-year-old kid climbing around the scrap steel pile.
yeah, well, and that was
Sweet.
the thing, is like within, I think, within 3 or 4 years, they had shut that down. You could drop off scrap metal, but you were not allowed to dig
Right.
around in it anymore, which was
Sure.
unfortunate. Um, but yeah, so that was how I got my start.
And and
Yeah.
and when you leading in, so you said, so I guess your inspirations and what you had known and understood about forging and weapon making came from a lot of books, from like Lord of the
came
Rings. What
from
is
Yeah, came from a lot of you know, kind of cheesy fantasy novels. You know, I had read the Lord of the Rings. There's not really any forging in there, but you know, like read
you mean you can't
Dragonlance.
hammer two sword blade shards together? Put them back
That's right.
together?
Hey man, it's that little sprinkle they put on. You didn't
That's right.
notice they
The the
sprinkled
elf
and it
dust.
bounced off the elbow,
Right.
and that's
They
why it
salt
worked.
bait it.
Salt beta, exactly. You know, and if you do it that way, and then you swing from somewhere in the next county. You know, you gotta
Okay.
really get that arm
Right.
way back. Hit it as hard as you can. Yeah, you you hit it so hard that the atoms actually fuse with each other. It's
Right.
it's perfect. Yeah, we we can get into you know,
All the
steel
ridiculousness.
packing later, or edge packing, whatever people call it. You know, but but yeah, so that was kind of where my inspiration came from, which provided absolutely zero guidance on how to actually do it. You know, it's
Right.
uh, I wanted to make swords and other weapons, but no idea how to actually do it. Luckily, there was an actual, like, a real honest to god blacksmith who was uh, just like 10 minutes down the road.
Oh,
This
wow.
guy named Peter Brown. He's, as far as I know, still working up in Maine, a little town of Edgecombe, Maine, and
Wow.
he does great, especially decorative work. But you know, he dabbled in a lot of different stuff,
Sure.
and so I went. You know, I would go with questions and talk to him, and uh,
Were you
do, you
like,
know,
"I wanna make
just
a sword."
yeah, exactly. Just like, get out of here, kid. No, he was super helpful. Um, you know, I think like a lot of people who get into blacksmithing and knife making, he got into it as a way to avoid dealing with people. So probably having me there wasn't the best, but he put up with it. And then you know, once I actually started getting into more knife making,
Mhm.
I was very fortunate. There was a really great knife maker who practically nobody has heard of. His name's Mud Sherigan. And
It's a very interesting name.
yes,
Mud.
Mudd Sherigan.
Okay.
And he was just one town over in Wiscasset. Although sort of ironically, again, maybe people don't know him now, but also in Wiscasset, Maine, was Larry Fagan, who was one of the first people to do absolutely ridiculous folding knives with all the crazy carvings and stuff. I've never met him. he was right there. I've never met him in my life. Yeah. Which probably speaks more to my antisocial aspects than anything about him. But yeah, and so I spent probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 years starting to get into making knives. I was taking them down to can't remember exactly the name of it. It was a little knife shop in Freeport, Maine, right down the street from LL Bean's. And yeah, and like Nick Rossi, he got his start actually working there, I believe, but then later, selling knives through there. Great little shop that had, kind of a mix of, commercial knives, but also, also customs. So it gave me a good place to sell stuff, but also, they actually knew what knives were supposed to be. Whereas, here I was, still like, not necessarily making a huge number of fantasy knives, but I think a lot of knife makers start off with an idea of what a knife is, and it's just this construct in your mind. And once you start getting people to use your knives, that's when you start to find out what a knife actually is. It's kind of like if you talk to artists who do paintings or drawings or things like that. Part of the difficulty is that what our brain sees isn't really what's there, and they have to draw what is actually there so that when they finish it, it looks like what we're expecting. But up until that point, it's it doesn't look quite right. You have to see things in a different way. So that was definitely, it was great to have that resource that I could take knives in, and they would look at them and be like, oh, this handle actually sucks. You should not make a handle like this. It looks good, but when you actually use it, it's terrible. Stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. And that's so many knife makers start off making complete garbage, and you need that feedback.
So were you only making knives, or were you practicing other blacksmithing skills? Did you apprentice at all, or was it more of you had your own kind of setup and then you would pop over to other maker shops every once in a while when you had questions, and then come back to your shop and do more work and work through kind of troubleshooting?
Right. Pretty much mostly the latter. I did work for I guess 3 months for a guy who did actually production blacksmithing. The Scottish Lion. Again, there were a lot of blacksmiths right in my area. I was lucky that way. He was about a half-hour drive away, and I guess would have been during my senior year of high school. I did homeschooling for my junior and senior years, and for the senior year, I was taking college classes and then working for him, and I did that for 3 months. And it was like making hundreds of hooks in a day, or forging out curtain rod ends, or all this stuff, which is just mind numbing. But at the same time, it's a lot of forging.
Sure.
And there is nothing to nothing to get you good at swinging a hammer like just making the same stuff over and
Sure.
over again. And and specifically trying to make it as fast as possible.
Right.
And he was a really big guy, so it was it was hard to keep up. But that
Okay.
it definitely helped me develop much better hammer skills. It wasn't like fun hammer tricks like anything intricate, but you want me to draw out a point on something. Boy, I've done that a few times.
um, and at some point, were you working in like a reenactment village?
Yes. Well, so I during the summers, partly so I would have shop space. There
Okay.
was in Boothbay Harbor, Maine. I think it's still there. There was a like a railroad village where
Okay.
they had the narrow gauge trains. It's kind of a cool place. Super cheese ball tourist trap essentially. Um, but
That's the best kind.
the coolest thing they had there, aside from the train, which they had a great machine shop because they had to make all the parts for
Oh, so it's
their
not like an
train.
actual steamworks.
Oh yeah, yeah. This was honest to God real train.
Wow.
Steam locomotive. So and they had a couple of them so that as one stopped working, they could rotate in.
Sure.
And it just did this like little half-mile loop around the property. But it was it gave me an opportunity. I did demonstrations there during the summer, so it gave me space to work because they had kind of the remnants of a blacksmith shop. They had tried to set one up, never really never got all the parts. Really, they had some
I see.
tools, not other tools. So it worked out well. At that point I had some tools, but working there during the summers, I had it was a lot better than just trying to set up at home. Um, and by that point, the quality of my demos was at least up to the quality of most of their displays, so it was a good fit. Uh,
Perfect.
but yeah, that was it was also my first exposure, through going and just talking to the people who did all the machining for the train. That was my first exposure to kind of that side of metalworking. Just seeing
Okay.
how lathes worked. Not that I was
Sure.
really doing any lathe work, but
Right.
just kind of seeing somebody who really knew what they were doing in action.
For
Yeah,
sure.
and that doing that pretty much carried me up through uh, through most of 1999. At which point, my wife and I got married, and she got a job in Connecticut, and I moved to Connecticut. And at that
Okay.
point, I had already, I guess, probably like 2 years prior to that, I had started my own business selling knives. Uh, and it was Dragon's Breath Forge. So that name, that website, all that goes way back into the mid
I see.
'90s.
You were
Yeah,
the original.
I,
That's right.
I was
That's where that
the
came
I
from.
was I was the OG. I've never figured out what that exactly means, but it's one of those things.
Original gangster.
Gangster. Yeah, that's that exactly.
You were the
So
OG.
I was the
Dragon's Breath
OG
Forge.
Dragon's Breath Forge. Um,
Okay. Wow. So you have been doing this kind of work basically since you were a child. I mean, at various levels,
yes,
but
yes,
you've been in this and you've been on this path since you were a child, basically,
yes.
which is
Yep.
pretty wild that you tapped into that so early. Um, and then just were like, instead of being like, nah, I'm over it. In fact, and then went on to something else. You're like, I want to go deeper. What do you like? So what do you think that was when you were when you were so young that like kept driving you and pushing you? It's just like
I
a level of curiosity or
Yeah,
go-
yeah. Well, and I think so. I think there's a couple things. One, My my dad is a person, he's very scientifically minded, and he my parents were always very much like, if you're interested in something, go for it, find out more. They I'm not going to say that they sat there and encouraged me, because they didn't. What they did was they didn't stop me from doing pretty much
They
anything.
gave you
There
they
were,
made space for you to do your thing.
yeah, I was the youngest child by 5 years. I've got a brother and a sister, and they're both quite a bit older. So by the
Mhm.
time I came around, my parents were done, and
I see.
so
You were an oopsie baby.
yeah, I had a lot of space to
Sure.
do whatever I wanted. And especially then being in Maine, we lived kind of in the middle of nowhere,
Okay.
and um, like it was literally a quarter mile to our closest neighbor. We lived,
Oh, wow.
yeah, and we lived, uh, you know, about an eighth mile off the road. So it was, and we lived for a year with no power or running water, stuff like that. It was formative. Um,
Very off grid.
very off grid, yeah. So uh, so I guess part of why I stuck with it was actually my dad, being this very curious person, very scientifically minded person. He had a tendency to become interested in something. He would learn kind of as much as he wanted to about it, and he would lose interest in it. And so he switched careers numerous times as I was growing up. And I definitely saw that as much as, sure, he was starting on new things that he was interested in, it was hard on him. And
Sure.
so partly I didn't really want to do that. But I think also, something that a lot of knife makers discover is that knife making is an incredibly deep craft.
Sure.
There is space for, if you want to dive deep on performance. No, don't climb. Different cat now trying to go on the keyboard. If you want to go deep on performance, that space is there. If you want to, go crazy on metallurgy or Damascus patterns, or whatever it is, there is a lot of space for exploration. And so what I really found, and why I've stuck with it all this time, is that there's always new stuff. If I want to go deeper on something,
Sure.
there is always the space to do that. Here, we'll get another. Whoop, nope, not going to get a flyby. This cat's smart. Stand behind the keyboard. You go away.
That's great. That's wild that you at I mean, you didn't say exactly what age, but it sounds like at a young age you were able to recognize that. Were you like in your teens or something like that when you were like,
Yeah,
I see what my dad's doing and I don't want to do that.
yeah, yeah. That was because I really started seriously making knives.
Yeah.
When I was, let's say, 17. That was,
Okay.
there were a couple years of making a lot of garbage, or at least like a year and a half of making a lot of garbage. But then, and I started making, at that age, I had started making Damascus steel, mostly, a lot of cable Damascus,
Sure.
and uh, and yeah, I just looked at it and I was like, this is what I want to do. Um, and I had opportunities to do other things, and I will say that I'm sure part of it was a certain amount of laziness. It's very easy to look, to look at some, other career paths and be like, oh, okay, well, I could, you know, not that I ever wanted to be a lawyer, but like, oh, well, if you want to be a lawyer, wow, you got 4 years of college, and then you got, however many, at least 2 years of law school. Just like that takes so long. Ugh.
Sure.
Or I can do what I'm already doing, which I already enjoy.
Yeah.
So, uh, I think that certainly played into it, but it was also a recognition, at a pretty young age that
Sure.
I didn't want to do what my dad had done. As when I
Yeah.
was growing up, I was actually born in Connecticut, but then during the time that I don't remember, we lived for a while in Vermont, where my dad worked on a dairy farm. Why I don't know why he worked on a dairy farm in Vermont, but he did. Um, and then we moved to Annapolis, Maryland, where he actually worked at a place that developed and built radar systems. And then we moved to Indiana, where he was a Quaker minister for a couple of years. And yeah, of course those go together.
I was all over the
And
place. Yeah.
yeah, and then we moved to Michigan, where he worked at a place that made photovoltaic panels. And then we moved to Maine, and since my parents still live in Maine, and during the time that we were there, we ended up moving during a downturn in the economy. So we moved, and suddenly it was hard to get a job. But he was a high school science teacher. He worked as a sternman on lobster boats. He worked construction, and then eventually started working on tugboats, and actually eventually worked his way up to being, I'm trying to remember now if he ever made it to being captain on any of the tugboats, but he made it up to first mate anyways. And yeah, which is a long process just in and of itself. But I looked at that and I was like, he's following his passion, but I don't want to do all these different things, because every time you're starting at square one.
Right.
And I much more I like the idea of building over time, and maybe going back and branching out, but not
Sure.
starting over completely. So that's what I've tended to do over the years, is find interesting side paths and explore them. And with wootz, you had alluded to that earlier. How did I fall down that rabbit hole? I think it was in 1998, 1999, somewhere around there, that Al Pendre put out articles in, I believe he put them out both in Blade magazine and in Abana, the Artist Blacksmiths Association, their magazine, The Anvil's Ring. He had articles about wootz in both, and it just really captivated me, this idea. And he was definitely a person who talked up the material, which if he was anything, he was a very good blacksmith, very good bladesmith, but he was a very good salesperson. That was definitely anybody who knows him. Not that I know him super well or knew him super well, but it was pretty obvious to me that he was very good salesperson. Maybe not in the sense of selling the knives, but selling the idea.
Selling the idea.
Sure. If you watch his videos, read the articles, things like that, he talks it up. And so I was like, ooh, this is exciting. And so before moving to Connecticut, I had done a couple of little experiments that were total failures, and then I had figured out how kind of what I needed to do a proper experiment. And so then in 2001, actually there was a knife customer of mine who I was talking to, and he was like, yeah, if you can make it, I'll buy it. So
Cool.
Actually, yeah, it was 2001 was when I really started in earnest, and I think it was probably my fourth or fifth ingot that actually was the first one that I forged usable material out of, and I just haven't looked back.
Wild. And
Yeah,
you were mostly doing this kind of in a vacuum. I mean, it sounds like you'd seen a couple articles, but you were doing it the good old fashioned trial and error way,
yeah,
right?
it's yeah. So the articles that Al had done were kind of the non-scientific version. Those the ones that he did for Blade or definitely for Anvil's Ring. I'm pretty sure it was also in Blade.
No.
And but he was also at that point he was working with John Verhoeven, who's
Okay.
metallurgist, I think University of Iowa, maybe. That
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. And he Verhoeven's still doing stuff. Not just with crucible steel, but also just general metallurgy for knife makers. Because I think he's always had an interest in bringing that scientific side to knife makers, so that so it demystifies a lot of stuff.
Sure.
People maybe people will figure out that you don't have to quench with your knife pointing north.
What?
Stuff. Yeah, no, that's one of the things that's out there. I've actually heard that. Oh yeah, when you quench, you have to have your knife facing north, because if you don't, as it becomes magnetic again, the magnetic pull of the earth will be pulling on it and will bend the tip of your
Mm,
knife to point north.
interesting. See, I
Yeah.
always pointed straight towards the center of the earth because of the gravitational pull would help keep it straight.
And it's funny because gravity is a lot stronger than the magnetic force of the earth. I don't know if you've noticed, but you don't find your wristwatch pointing north very often.
No, I
It's
don't.
whereas your feet generally do point down. If you fall, you don't move towards the North Pole. However, you do move towards the Earth. So I like yours a lot better.
Sweet.
But
That's what I'm gonna start telling people.
yeah. Well, and of course, aside from the quenching, it's obviously very helpful to have your blade vertical while you're heating it. If you've got a setup that you can do that, it doesn't matter too much with knives. Once you get into swords are this whole different beast.
Yes.
That I think a lot of knife makers have gone on Forged in Fire and found out that a sword is not a big knife.
Really? You were just
Yeah, it's
blowing me away
crazy.
right now.
Yeah, it's a crazy thing, but I think a huge number of people have discovered that. But yeah, it was so I did have some articles to work from, and I will say that I knowing that Pendray and Verhoeven were working together, I managed to track down some of their scientific articles that they had written, and so then trying to understand those articles, I did, that was where I really got into metallurgy. It was so I could,
Okay.
I needed to learn metallurgy to understand what they were saying. And I will say that as I've learned more and more about making wootz, I find the gaps in those articles to be pretty large. They're not, they're not obvious when you're first reading them. You read them and
Right.
you're like, oh yeah, this clearly explains the whole
Just like
process.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you figure out, wow, there's, there are a few things that they kind of gloss over, like, there'd be like one sentence in one article that says, oh, so then we changed our forging technique and this helped the alignment. well, but what'd you do? How'd you change it? And it's one line in one article, never to be mentioned again.
Well, and I've seen those articles, and it usually references another article.
Oh yeah, there's lots of references, and which is fine. That's
Yeah.
common practice to be like,
Yeah.
we did this in the last article. I'm not going to tell you about it again. Go read that.
Sure.
And but that can be tricky because their understanding and their avenues that they were exploring changed over time. So they have, in one of their earlier articles, they have pictures of the dendritic structure. So the micrographs of the dendritic structure that have been etched to reveal phosphorus, because you can etch for phosphorus. There are specific etchants that really bring that out, and phosphorus is known to segregate during solidification. So they're kind of using this as a stand-in to say, like, hey, here's what the structure looks like. And then, they did this long roast on the steel. So basically, brought it up, I think, to like 1200 degrees Celsius, which I think it's like 2200, 2250 Fahrenheit, something like that.
Okay.
Mareko is going to find this out for us. But, they brought it up to this temperature for, I think it was 10 hours, 12 hours, something like that.
It's 2190 Fahrenheit.
2190. Okay, so I was in the vicinity.
Maybe 1100 Celsius, 2000.
Yeah, 1100 is around 2000. That's 1100 is like 2025. But in either case, they bring it up and they roasted it for this long period. And this was based partly on historical accounts that seem to indicate that at least in some cases the ingots were roasted. The historical accounts they're all over the place. There's stuff telling you to do all kinds of stuff. They've all been translated numerous times. Very often,
they're recorded by outsiders too, right? Not the actual people doing the work.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't the smiths writing it down. There are a few accounts though that are firsthand accounts. They were then translated a few times, which makes it a little iffy. But they were firsthand accounts, not by blacksmiths, but by one of them in particular. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a very widely respected scholar in, I believe it was in Persia, and he wrote about like gems. He wrote about everything, and so he was very technically oriented individual. But the difficulty is, as we know, being a blacksmith, you think about things in a slightly different way than people who are watching what you're doing.
Sure.
And kind of one aspect of this was that the color of steel, how it was described, changed over time. So now we look at it, we're like, oh, well, you've got the very top end, it's like white, and then you come down into like yellow, and then you work down through yellow into orange, and then into red, and then eventually to black. But they pretty much, at least most of these accounts, pretty much just have red and white, and then modifiers for red and white. So you have like, strong red. What the hell is strong red? What does that mean?
That's what you eat before you work out.
Exactly. Got to get all your protein in there. But in either case, so swinging back around to Verhoeven and Pendrite, they would roast this ingot, and then then they had a sort of follow-up micrograph showing, hey, you can see that the structure has changed, that diffusion has happened. But again, it was all phosphorus, because phosphorus is what they could etch for. this was taken as a proxy for, everything in the steel diffuses, which to some degree it does. It's just that, the element that they really focused in on was vanadium, and
Okay.
vanadium is almost the same size as iron. In the at the atomic scale, they are a very similar atom, and so it diffuses. Fly by. Diffuses very, very, very slowly in comparison to phosphorus. So there's a lot of things like that kind of get glossed over. They don't really talk about what the actual diffusion speed of vanadium is, versus phosphorus, which is what they were taking the pictures of.
Sure.
And then the articles after that just ignore the idea completely, and just kind of take it as a given that, well, we roast it and this happens. It's like, in general, metallurgists will say that, okay, in whether it's in wootz or in commercial steels, you start off with this dendritic structure, which is a very square lattice structure. The dendrites themselves look. Yeah. Well, so this one. Yeah. So this one just
roasted.
Well, this one is a that has what are called grain boundary carbides, or GBC. So this is one of the two most likely structures you'll have in your ingot after it solidifies. Somewhere or another, I've got a picture showing the dendritic, and it really is. It's like a grid. It almost looks like a map, a picture from space of New York City or something like that. It's not a perfect grid because different dendrites start growing, and they'll come in at different angles. So you'll have these spots where for a while everything's oriented this way, and then suddenly it runs into orientation going a different direction. But the metallurgists just maintain that all those dendrites during the forging just kind of lay down, and everything lays down and becomes flat, and this is how you get the sheets. And it glosses over entirely the fact that even in commercial steels, where you're going from massive ingots, assuming you're not dealing with the like CPM
5,000
steels.
pound melt.
Oh yeah,
right?
Yeah, 5,000, 10,000. They're massive. You're looking at big ingots, and especially like the lower the grade of the steel, the bigger the ingot at the beginning, generally speaking, because the bigger the ingot gets, the more it segregates. It becomes harder to keep the chemistry even throughout. But in either case, even in commercial steels, they don't all end up with this nice sheet structure. It doesn't all look like perfect layers. Some steels A2 is known for having this nice flowing structure to it, whereas like 1095, most people who get banding in 1095, you definitely still see a lot of that grid appearance to it. You still have a lot of that dendritic structure in there. And the same is true if you look at historical wootz. What I think one major disservice that Pendray and Verhoeven did was they defined wootz, and they weren't the first ones to do it, but they definitely definitely perpetuated this. They defined wootz as a very specific thing. They wanted to they wanted a very specific goal. We want to produce this almost layered structure, this sheet morphology. But if you look at historical blades, they're all over the place.
Sure.
There was
I have some
really,
examples actually. Let me try to pop one up.
yeah,
Oh
you
no,
know, because
that's not it.
you see, well, yeah, so like that one, it's not a great picture, but you can see, it has a nice flow to it. But in the areas where we've cut through, and we're seeing some of the cross section, you start to see a little bit of a grid-like structure. And some of them were extreme, like this one here in the lower left-hand corner.
Right.
There's a pretty distinct area where we're seeing squares,
Right.
and that's remnant from the initial structure of the ingot, the as solidified structure. Now it's been modified a lot through forging,
Yeah.
to create that nice swirling appearance. But it was one thing that I've been frustrated by, because Pendray and Verhoeven really focused in on this very lamellar structure, this layered look, that was particularly known from some of the Persian blades. Also, in a much finer pattern, finer in the sense that it's more tightly packed. There were a lot of Indian wootz blades have that same, very sheet-like structure, but it's not as broad a pattern. But so they had focused in on, we want to reproduce this, and kind of as part of that, essentially defined, wootz is this, whereas in
Sure.
fact wootz, as most people use the term these days, wootz encompassed a pretty broad range. It was
spectrum of
crucibles.
patterning.
Yeah, a broad spectrum of patterns. There was actually a fairly broad spectrum of chemistries. So like,
Sure.
depending, obviously huge amounts of wootz was produced in India. In a few different spots in India, there were production centers that just pumped out ingots for centuries. And then, and there were other areas that, at least for periods of time, produced crucible steels. And they didn't all use exactly the same technique, so most of the Indian ingots were quite small. They were, between 2 and 4 pounds, so like just enough to make a sword out of.
Right.
Whereas, if you go up, I think it was in what's now Kazakhstan, there was an area where, based on the crucibles, they were making more like, 8-pound ingots, which an 8-pound ingot is a big thing to forge by
That's
hand.
massive. Yeah, I can't even
Yeah.
imagine how you approach that by hand.
Yeah, well, and that was, they would obviously, you'd have multiple strikers with sledgehammers. That was the only way you were going to get it done. And actually, there are historic paintings from Persia, and I think also from Turkey, showing teams of strikers working ingots.
Right.
So you get an idea that, the only reason that you have strikers is if you're going to work fast. It's
Right.
not worth having, six guys with sledgehammers standing around if it's going to take you a whole day to forge out one ingot. The economics of that just don't work. So
Sure.
it becomes, just looking at things like that, looking at the scale of, how much, just the sheer number of swords and other weapons that were made from wootz over the centuries, and knowing that the vast majority of them are gone. That, what we see is this tiny little snippet of the wootz blades that were ever made.
Right.
And then of course they made blades, they made armor, they made helmets, all kinds of stuff. The the one thing that really was never made from wootz was firearms. The structure of wootz, its characteristics are not good for firearms.
Sure.
So the one thing that or one theory as to why wootz may have fallen out of favor is simply that it was good for edged weapons. The performance of edged weapons became less and less important over time. And so steel that was appropriate for making firearms became much more economically viable.
Sure.
There are other reasons, but certainly a bit of colonialism played into it. By the 1700s, 1800s, most wootz most of the wootz that was still being made, or the crucible steel that was still being made, was being made in India. And at that time, India was under British control. We all know that one of the things the British loved to do was, they would make it so that their colonies couldn't produce any finished goods, because what they wanted to do was get the cheap resources, bring them back to England, make stuff in England, and then sell it to the colonies so that they can make lots of money. It's exactly why the United States exists, is that people got pissed off, living in this resource-rich environment and having to pay to have things brought from England. The exact same stuff was going on in India, and quite honestly, at a much larger scale.
Sure.
And it's really kind of tragic if you look at the way that, if you look at India, how vibrant it was and how vibrant their economy was before the British came, and just what the British very purposefully did so that the British could make money off the Indians.
Sure.
It's sorry, I did just one fun little fact for people. So if you look in India, they have just enormous amounts of gold and silver ornaments. And this was especially true before the British showed up, but just vast amounts of gold in this place. There's really very little gold in India. India does not produce its own gold. Almost all of that gold came from the Americas. So the Spanish and other colonial powers were taking gold and silver out of the Americas so that they could buy spices from India and from further east. And so just this vast amount of gold got transferred into India. So that's why there's so much there.
What a trip.
It's a wild thing. Absolutely wild.
I just want to pause for a second, because you're getting into some really cool stuff, but I wanted to try to pause for a second and talk about some definitions, and also try to get an idea of timelines of like when. Let me start with this question: when was the when was some of the earliest crucible steels being made? Where were they being made? And then, like you were just kind of talking about, they were in fashion for a long time, and then they went out of fashion as materials and demand changed. And so what does that timeline look like?
So the historic or the archaeological record isn't great, because most of the production centers were in Middle East, in Southeast Asia, India, that area, down into Sri Lanka. And also, up into, kind of the southern steppes areas of Central Asia. There were production centers since, in the many centuries since, the towns that they were near became cities and spread out and covered those old production centers. So there are not very many existing examples of here's a full furnace and
Okay.
all the stuff. What they have found huge amounts of, and often how they kind of track down where these production centers were, is that they find all the crucible fragments.
Right. Okay.
The crucibles that were being made for steel production were completely different than any of the pottery that was being made, any of the crucibles that were being made for, say, copper or precious metals, because crucibles for steel not only need to withstand much higher temperatures, but iron oxide is actually a pretty serious fluxing agent. So it will eat its way through a lot of materials that other, like gold or copper or things just wouldn't be corrosive to. And so they found entire sections of roads that the underlayment of the road is just broken crucibles, for like
Oh, wow.
miles, and multiple feet deep of
Wow.
broken crucibles that have been used to build up a roadbed. And so they've kind of, to some degree anyways, been able to calculate just how much volume was being produced. And the earliest examples from I can't remember now if it was India or Sri Lanka. The earliest examples that they have found pointing to crucible steel production are to right around zero. So going back 2 millennia. Yeah, no, it goes back a long ways. There is thought that it possibly goes back even further, because there are historical accounts from the Greeks that seem to be talking about crucible steels. So yeah, it's a very old technology. It definitely developed over time, and the reason that it was so different, what made crucible steel so different than everything else that was being made. It didn't matter where you were in the world, other than the Americas, where they never really started working iron, or we're just starting to dabble maybe, but everywhere else, you're making what's called bloomery iron, essentially. There were different furnaces in different places, different designs, but the basic thing you got out of that, you would put ore and charcoal in the top, and what you'd get is this spongy mass.
So what's a bloomery? So just really quick, what does a bloomery look like? It's like a big cheese, basically.
Well, so a bloomery, they're a relatively short, normally like 4 foot tall furnace. It's a shaft furnace. Maybe the ones I've seen have typically been, an internal bore of 12 inches or less. I know larger ones were made. The bigger you make your furnace, the more likely you are to get cast iron rather than a bloom. And right, because the longer the period of time that the charcoal and the iron oxide interact, first it gets reduced to iron, and then it starts absorbing carbon. And if you reach a point where the basically the temperature and the carbon content pass each other, in a sense, where the carbon content of your iron has increased enough that the temperature you're at becomes the melting temperature, suddenly, bam, that iron will melt and it will pick up carbon very, very quickly, all the way up to about 4.25% carbon. And they're yeah, well, exactly. And also under those conditions, the iron picks up sulfur, phosphorus, almost anything else that was in that ore or in that charcoal when you get that, that super reducing atmosphere,
Mhm.
almost all those things will reduce and become part of the iron. And most of those impurities, plus all that extra carbon, were very problematic. So most bloomeries, most steel production or iron production was specifically aimed at not getting cast iron.
Right.
Some places, like China, I believe, actually, they were the first place to really start making cast iron on purpose, making use of it as cast iron.
Okay.
They were very early on that. But in most areas, what they were making, and I believe this was true in China, even though they had cast iron, what they really wanted for making blades was a bloom, which is this ragged mass of all these little iron particles. They were never quite molten, and they just kind of weld together down at the bottom of the furnace. And they call it a sponge because it looks like a sponge. If you get one of those old natural sponges made from the creature, the sponge, it's what it looks like. It's a gnarly material. It's got chunks of charcoal in it. It's got maybe pieces of the refractory that have broken off the inside of your furnace. It's got a huge amount of silica slag trapped in there. So that material, you would take that, you would consolidate the bloom into a more solid mass, and then you would need to forge that out and fold it and forge it out and fold it. People say, that sort of the common mythology is that Japanese swords were amazing because they got folded so many times. But the fact is that that same process was being used basically everywhere. The Japanese system was a little different in some ways, but it was a variation on essentially a worldwide theme of
Interesting.
how do you take that ragged mass and make it usable.
Sure.
And so the big advantage that crucible steel had was that it didn't have all that slag in it. The bloom, you never get all the slag out. If you look, so wrought iron, part of why it has the characteristics that it has is it still has slag in it. It still has this silica slag in it. And if you look at antique swords, other weapons that are made starting from bloomery iron, it's in there. You look at micrographs and there's a very distinct grain, and you see these little stringers, these pockets of silica slag. And of course, silica slag, it's essentially glass. So it's not a good material. It does not, it doesn't improve. Yeah, it doesn't improve your characteristics. The one thing you can say for wrought iron or bloomery iron is that when it breaks, it's essentially a bunch of fibers, that are pretty well bonded together. So when it breaks, it typically doesn't just snap all the way across. It'll tear across,
Right.
generally. But the advantage of crucible steel was, since you actually achieved the full melting temperature of your material, all that slag would just float out. And so you had this incredibly solid, relatively homogeneous mass. Because that's the other thing about that bloom, is that, parts of it would be very high carbon because, just because of, the bloomeries are mostly anyways, there were different designs, but most of them have a single air feed. And so your bloom that's created is very different on one side than the other side. One side will be almost pure iron. The other side will be, higher carbon content.
It's hot. It's not spending as much time at a higher temperature as it.
Well, you have the difference in temperature, and also since one side is where the air is coming in, it tends to be a little bit more oxidizing. So you're not going to be picking up as much carbon. But yeah, it's you almost invariably had a gradient. So like the Japanese, one thing they did that was kind of specific was that they would forge that down and then break it up. So you could actually physically separate and say, okay, so this material breaks this way, so it has these kind of properties. And of course, nobody really knew, oh, there's carbon in there. That's really a much more recent development, knowing what's actually in there. But smiths always had ways of testing the properties, so they would know what they were working with. So the Japanese, one thing they did, like I said, was they would break it up and separate out into kind of different qualities. But with the crucible steel, you have the same quality throughout. It's the same thing, top to bottom, side to side. And so blades forged out of out of crucible steels at the time were much, much higher quality. You would have a much more consistent cutting edge. You didn't have all, people talk about how, oh, wootz, it cut so well because it was, micro serrated with the carbides. I'm not going to say there wasn't some truth to that. But if you compare that to the other option, which was steel made out of lots of fibers with silica slag in between them, that's some ragged stuff.
Sure.
So the crucible steel actually gave a much more consistent edge, and it gave consistent properties over the length of your blade. It gave, there were a lot of reasons why it was considered to be superior. It had some serious downsides, though. Depending on what ore you used, and typically crucible steel was made by, first you'd run your material, you'd run your ore through a bloomery, and then so you'd have that gnarly mass, and then you would put that in a crucible and melt it with additional charcoal and make this much higher carbon, typically 1.5 to 1.8% carbon, in a lot of the antique blades. So downside of that, if you were getting phosphorus or sulfur from your original ore, or you were picking it up in the bloomery process, it's going to end up in that ingot. Some of that stuff will float out, but most things, both phosphorus and sulfur bond with iron very tightly. So getting them out once they're in there is very, very hard. So you could still have those problems. You also had this, you could see it as an advantage, or you could see it as an issue, a problem. You had this extremely high carbon content. So working the steel in ways that made use of that high carbon content rather than having it be a detriment, that was important. It had it had different forging characteristics. It had different ways it had to be forged.
Interesting.
The end prop.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I wonder, they must have had a way to kind of test what forging characteristics it had before they continued, because they couldn't, like you're saying right now, you can't necessarily forge two ingots that have very different things in them, especially one that might be phosphorus rich. You can't forge it the same as something that might be like have low phosphorus content.
Right.
And so,
yeah, because phosphorus, it's not quite as bad as sulfur this way, but phosphorus can make steel hot short. Sulfur is so hot short. Basically, another fun fact you find out. Short, as used in blacksmithing, goes back to the same root source as shortbread, or also shortening. They were. It means to crumble.
Okay.
So shortbread is crumbly. People would add shortening to things that they were, to baked goods to make, give them that crumbly quality. And so steels that are hot short, that means that when they're hot, they become crumbly. And a lot of knife makers have probably experienced this, where you heat up your steel and you hit it, and it's almost like a sand sculpture, or particularly I like to refer to it as a wet sand fracture, because that's what it always looks like to me.
Yeah.
Or if you're working with clay and it's not good quality clay, and you start working it, and it just cracks apart.
I've definitely
And so
that.
What's that?
I said I've definitely experienced that. I think you've actually been there for a few of those.
Yes, yeah, especially with the Damas steel. Yeah, fun stuff.
$1,000 out the window, no problem. Whatever.
Chuck it. Yeah, a very definite top end temperature for the Damas steel, and really it's for a similar reason. So you get hot shortness when a portion of your material has become liquid. So in the case of sulfur and phosphorus, both of those will combine with iron, and that molecule has a lower melting temperature than the iron itself. So phosphorus in particular is known to concentrate at grain boundaries. So you're heating up, your phosphorus is concentrated at your grain boundaries. It has formed this eutectic with iron. So a eutectic is basically, that refers to the lowest possible melting temperature. When you combine two things, whatever combination has the lowest possible melting temperature is referred to as the eutectic of the two. But so you hit this temperature, that iron phosphate melts, and it's typically, I believe it's a combination of iron, phosphorus, and carbon that creates this eutectic. Melts, and now all of your grains, all those little crystals that make up the iron, they're all now surrounded by liquid. So right. It will still it does a really good job of looking like a solid material. It still definitely looks, and then you hit it and it just comes apart.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it is. It looks like wet sand because it pretty much is wet sand. And it's always, knowing that is great, but in some ways makes it more frustrating, because when that happens, that if you'd been maybe 20 degrees cooler, it all would have been fine.
Right.
If you had, because generally, if you heat up into that partial liquid area and then drop back down, normally everything comes back together just fine, and you never know that it happened, as long as you don't hit it with a hammer.
Interesting. So you can get to that point where it starts melting along the grain boundaries, but then you can bring it back down to a cooler temperature and still work it, and it would be solid. So to stabilize that is just to make sure you're working in the proper temperature range.
Right. And so the work I doing a lot with wootz, I have a thermocouple in my forge now. So I have a much better idea what the temperature of the forge is, and therefore, what a better sense of what's the temperature of my steel. I'm doing stuff that's probably a bit more technical than what a lot of folks want to get into, but it's still a really nice reference, especially now that you can go on Amazon and you can buy a pyrometer and a thermocouple, and you're talking like $75.
I need to get one of those. I should be working. I've been forging the Damasteel just by eye, and
Well, and
Will
that's the thing.
Brigham was like,
Once
"That's terrible."
yeah, well, and especially because the Damasteel also has a distinct lower end to the forging
Mhm.
range. You know,
Yeah,
you don't go above this, but also don't go below this. You know, you go above it and you get wet sand fracture. You go below it and you get stress fractures.
yep.
Um, and you know, for a similar reason that you get that, you know, wootz typically has a similarly limited forging range, and they're both for the same basic reason, which is the top end you're getting partial liquid, and at the bottom end you just have too many carbides uh,
Mm,
in the steel. You know, if you think of the carbide, you know, carbides are naturally, you know, it's a molecule, so even just a single carbide molecule is many times larger than the iron atoms.
okay.
So you're basically, you know, you're putting these boulders into your matrix of you know, little marbles,
Right.
and you know, so the more of those you have, and the bigger they are, the harder it will be for the material to flow, because of course, you know, steel forges nicely because the iron atoms can move past each other, and uh, steel forges more easily at high temperatures because you essentially have more energy in the system. And so it's easier for the iron atoms to shift past each other and be like, okay, you know, first I was bonded here. Well, no, now I'll bond here. Now I'll bond here. They can shift very easily. So as you start throwing these larger carbide molecules in there, it just gums up the works. And pretty soon it's becomes very stiff under the hammer,
Sure.
and then it won't flow anymore, and so it fractures. You're still trying to move the material, but it can't move smoothly anymore, which means it will fracture.
It
uh,
reminds me of being at the airport recently.
oh
When it's just like, getting off the plane and people walking all over the place, and then somebody just decides they're done walking and they wanna look at something, and they're right in front of you.
yeah, yeah,
Ugh, yeah.
yeah, right. I mean, or you know, you look at traffic on a highway.
Mhm.
It doesn't take a very big disruption
Sure.
to
Oh,
kill
yeah,
that
just even
nice
just tapping
flow.
on the brakes. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You
So
know, you
it's just
kill
like
that flow, and pretty soon, you know, things just aren't moving like they should.
yeah.
Um, but
So so ingots were being cast as early as 0, if not possibly earlier, and they
mhm.
were in fashion until the 1700s, 1800s?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely uh, a serious fascination with wootz, um,
Okay.
up in you know up into you know, and it was continuing to be made definitely up into the mid 1800s. You know, I've talked to some people who say that there were smiths, you know, individual smiths who were still producing wootz and making blades from it, you know, up into like the 1950s.
Oh, wow.
I haven't actually, yeah, I haven't actually seen um, any material that was made during that period, you
Sure.
know, by traditional smiths. There was, however, you know, just absolute fascination with the material in Europe, and so it you can make a really strong argument that the you know, that the entire uh, modern steelmaking industry and our sort of modern understanding of metallurgy came from people trying to figure out wootz,
Oh, interesting.
how to make it, how, and specifically how to make the patterns in it.
Sure.
Because at a certain point, you know, if you don't, if you're not using edged weapons, you know, and they've kind of become, you know, swords have become ceremonial or decorative, you know, to a much larger degree. Uh, the performance side becomes of less interest. That there was still interest in it because there were so many stories of how amazing the material was. A lot of those stories, however, go back to the time of the Crusades, when by comparison, if you were comparing the wootz blades, that were being used pretty widely in the Middle East, if you compared those to the blades that the European Crusaders were using, the quality of the wootz blades was much, much higher. There tended to be a very different style of blade as well, but just generally speaking, the Crusaders came back. They brought blades with them, and they came back just talking about how, we came up against these swords that were crazy.
Right, because you hear stories about the wootz blades, or the Muslim blades, like cutting the European blades like in half and stuff like that.
Right, and and the fact is, obviously, we know physics tells us, you're not going to do that.
It takes a lot to shear metal.
Yeah, steel doesn't work that way. On the other hand, a little bit of hyperbole aside, you could certainly see situations in which, the wootz blades were clearly outperforming, whether it was that they were sharper or they were more durable, because the biggest problem that the European steel had at that time was that it was inconsistent. They just like they had problems with phosphorus in some places in the wootz blades, there were definitely problems with phosphorus in European blades. Most of the Viking swords that we talk about, or the pattern welded swords that we typically just lumped all of them together as, oh, these are Viking swords. It was a much bigger, bigger, broader tradition, and won't get into that. But most of that patterning was actually based on phosphorus. That they would combine steels with more phosphorus and steels with less phosphorus, because there wasn't really anything else in there. These days we have nickel in a lot of the steel. It just wasn't there, and carbon content. Sort of that an original understanding that people had of like, oh, I'm going to do pattern welded steel, and I'm going to use mild steel, and I'm going to use 1095, and my pattern is going to be based on the difference in carbon content. And we now know that was it was just a fairy tale, because carbon diffuses quite quickly, and especially as you get into higher layer counts, you're going to even that out pretty rapidly. Whereas phosphorus does not move as quickly. And phosphorus also, to some degree, blocks carbon migration. So if a smith put a higher phosphorus steel in their blade, they would actually get a pretty visible line. Phosphorus steels are just, they're just known for being a whiter steel. Just in general, they are quite a bit more resistant to corrosion of all kinds. Even relatively small amounts of phosphorus make a big difference in how reactive the iron is. Yeah. So like they
talk
good,
about, right? Because doesn't it also cause brittlement?
Yes. It's an interesting thing though, and I'll actually hopefully sometime pretty soon have some good videos that I'll be putting out that talk a little bit about phosphorus in steel. But I can say that phosphorus mostly, I'm not going to say entirely, I can't say that for certain, but mostly becomes a problem during tempering.
Interesting.
Because basically as with so many things in steel, your big problems with brittleness are based on what's in your grain boundaries. So I think most knife makers know if you have much finer grain structure, you have a much tougher steel. And the reason for this is that any cracks that are going to go through your steel have to go around the grain boundaries. They're going to follow the grain boundaries through the steel. They are not going to cleave through a grain. That's I can't say it's impossible, but the grains themselves, those crystals, are incredibly strong. So cracks go along the grain boundaries. That's the weak area, because where the grains meet, the iron lattice doesn't line up, and so there are always little gaps. The iron atoms all want to be exactly the same distance apart, and where you have two different directions meeting, you can't have that perfect spacing. So grain boundaries tend to have imperfections, sometimes called dislocations, basically. Spots where the lattice is not perfect. The reason that a finer grain is better is that now, at the microscopic level, that crack has to go around so many more grains. It has to change direction so many times. Whereas very large grain, you're going to have some nice straight lines to work with for that crack to make its way around. It doesn't need to change directions so many times.
There's less resistance for that breaking energy or whatever is causing the breaking. I see.
Exactly. And so brittleness, when it shows up in steels, typically shows up in the grain boundaries. And during the tempering process, phosphorus will diffuse to the grain boundaries where it forms iron phosphate. I believe iron phosphate, but forms a molecule that is much more brittle. So how you treat your phosphorus steel changes how much that brittleness affects you. So I've done tests where I've done wootz using historical levels of phosphorus and quench and temper, quench in oil, temper that blade, temper it first. I did a series of tests. So, temper first at about 300 degrees Fahrenheit, go to bend it, bam, super brittle. Be like, oh, okay, well, I'll try tempering hotter. It actually became more brittle the higher the tempering. Okay. Because it was more opportunity for the phosphorus to move to the edge. However, and so by the end of that, I was tempering at like 800 degrees, something like that. So I was going for a very soft temper, and at that point it started, we started to kind of come around the other side of it. It was a little bit less brittle, but it's still, you wouldn't get very far and just bam, explosion. And like brittle enough that it wouldn't break in one place. It would break in 2 or 3 places at once and actually, fling out a section of blade. Take that same steel and air quench it. So no longer going for martensite, therefore don't need to temper. So just one single cooling, from critical cooling as quickly as I could in front of a fan. And at that point, probably just having a very fine perlite structure, but with the high carbon content and the carbides and everything, still ending up at like 49 Rockwell. I was able to take that. It's not particularly hard. Yeah.
But
49 Rockwell. 49 Rockwell is pretty standard for antique swords.
Well, and
You
all
go
I was just
back.
gonna say real
Yeah.
quick, I think some of the softer German chef's knives, European chef's knives that are still being produced today are sometimes around
Yeah.
49, 50, 51. Pretty soft.
Yeah. I mean, anytime you want to be using a traditional steel on your blade, where you're gonna be straightening that edge with
Mhm.
a steel rather than with an abrasive. You want a pretty
Right.
soft. You want a pretty soft steel for that. But yeah, so that air quench. So by the time I did that highest temperature temper,
Mhm.
so actual quench and then temper to around 800 degrees, I was in the 49 to 50 Rockwell
Okay, yeah.
hardness.
Okay.
You've tempered it down a lot at that point, and it was crazy
Sure.
brittle. Um, versus the air quench, which was giving me basically the same hardness. I was able to bend this blade 90 degrees. Of course, it's soft, so it's not like it springs back, but bend it to
Right.
90 degrees and then essentially straighten it again, and it
Wow.
was still fine. Um, so, same chemistry, just very different treatment of the steel. And so, now if you look at historical accounts, and part of why I tried the air quench is that some of the historical accounts talk about, either they would cool the blade with, draft you know, from their forge, like in the sense of, they would take the bellows off and they would cool it that way, or
Yeah.
they had a special, they had walls built to concentrate prevailing winds.
Sure.
Probably the most ridiculous, at least to my mind, the most ridiculous is we handed it to a guy on horseback and he went riding off. And I was like, yes. And it bent like a piece of spaghetti. Exactly.
Hurry up and cool it off.
Yeah. Um, but the thing about that is they were air quenching these blades. And so
Sure.
it's very likely that the smiths had different treatments that they would use based on what their starting material was. So, if you were getting ingots from, Persia or wherever you were getting ingots from, you would say, okay, so these are typically, they need to be forged out and heat treated this way. That's how you get the best performance from it. In other places, they have a lot of evidence that the blades were being um, either just, quenched and tempered, or, uh, you know, edge quenched and then pull it out and let it auto temper. Um, or, just like slice it through the water a few times. And
Okay.
again, set it aside. Um, so there were, for the wootz blades, there were a lot of different treatments that were used. Um, and so, especially if we're looking at, kind of comparing that to, the Crusaders coming in at that time in Europe, the main consideration for your sword was it doesn't break. Um,
Mm.
Anybody who's used a sword to cut things, as long as you're cutting things that are appropriate, you're not going out and hitting a tree. Uh, you know, if you're in a sword fight, it doesn't matter if the person's wearing armor. There's still give. The
Sure.
person is going to move when they're hit, and or even sword edge on sword. There's still some give there. That was considered to be like the absolute worst thing you could do to your sword was to do edge to edge contact. And with good reason. But even so, anybody who's used a sword knows that the cutting ability of it is almost entirely just in the kinetic energy, in the speed that it's moving at, and you don't need a super sharp edge. You just need some kind of edge so that you're
Mm.
concentrating all that force down as small as possible. You know, and I guess a cutting edge is better, but if you're working against people in chainmail or whatever, it doesn't matter if you have a cutting edge on there. You're not going to cut through.
Sure.
You're not going to cut
Right.
through steel armor. You know, it kind of doesn't matter what kind of steel armor it is. You're not going to cut through it. And you know, some of the experiments that we did at Dragon's Breath Forge, we did try, you know, cutting tests versus penetrating tests, which,
Sure.
you know, this is where we really came to the conclusion that, yeah, you know, if you're going to be fighting people wearing armor, get yourself a warhammer. You know, nice spike on
Oh, yeah.
there.
I remember that
That'll
now.
go. It will literally go through anything. You
Yikes.
know, we didn't actually test it versus modern body armor, but my understanding is that spike on a warhammer will penetrate most modern body armor. Probably not all of it, but it'll go through Kevlar. It'll go through crazy stuff.
Leaving a big boo-boo.
Oh yeah, a lot of unhappiness there. But you know what it brings us back to is that you didn't need this amazing cutting edge. You know, we have this super fascination with it now, but back then, you know, the biggest thing was you wanted your sword to stay in one piece for the whole battle, and so
Right.
there was a tendency toward, you know, so that was like the main measure of performance.
Okay.
Did it continue to function? And
You're right.
you know, and it's very different than you know, the measures of performance we use now. You know, you talk to somebody and the first thing they want to know is, oh well, what's the Rockwell hardness of the edge? And you know, it's like, what are you cutting with this that you need this crazy hard edge? Are you
Sure.
cutting other steel with it? You know, because other, you know, like if you're cutting vegetables with it, you know, the vegetables aren't very hard. You know, you're
Sure.
it's probably not a huge deal. You'll need to sharpen it more often if it's softer, but it'll be easier
Yeah.
to sharpen. But that aside, this main performance thing was, did it continue to function? So softer blades were better. So like most of the European swords from that period were 40 to 45 Rockwell at the edge. They were very soft. So, you know, if they're 45 Rockwell and the wootz blades are, you know, 49 to 50 Rockwell, boy, you know, it seems like they're so much harder and so much sharper. And, you know, it's one of the problems with talking to people about wootz is that historically, you know, up until probably until the mid 1700s, there's a very good argument that wootz was the best steel on earth. But most of the stories about it, you know, the sort of the mythology that built up around it, most of that developed during a time when other places were making steel that was kind of garbage. You know, it was very functional. You know, it definitely worked, but by comparison, you know, there really was this huge difference. Like, oh wow, wootz is, you know, it's like the best thing by a long ways. And then slowly, you know, the control of the bloomery process got to be better and better, and consistency got better. People began to understand to a greater degree, you know, how to, you know, okay, so we're going to be making blades with this, so we need to get this higher grade ore, which has fewer impurities.
Right.
And so wootz essentially, you know, kind of reached this pinnacle and stopped, and then the rest of the world was catching up. And you know, certainly in terms of general use, other steels surpassed. You know, and once you know, once the I guess it was I think it was Huntsman in England actually looking at wootz and saying, oh, crucibles. He started making much larger crucibles. and doing crucible steel, where he was remelt. It started off anyways, just remelting, the highest grade steel he could get, and then in remelting it, and it was the highest grade, wrought steel. So it would have started as a wrought iron of some kind. Remelt that, the slag floats out, and bam, you've got a instantly much better product than what they'd had before. And so then the Huntsman process, that got developed further, and really, that's where the argument can be made that the modern steel industry was really birthed from looking at wootz and trying to figure it out. Not necessarily like we want to make this exact thing, but looking at it and saying, what is it that makes it what it is? What is it that makes wootz so different? What, in some ways perhaps makes it better, but just in general, what makes it so different, and how can we use that to make better steel? So yeah, that's so part of, there are a few different reasons why it died out. One reason, certainly, you could say is utility. Wootz, there for a long time. There, if you look at most of the cutlery that was produced in the late 1800s, early 1900s, I mean up until the 1950s, throughout Europe and the Americas, it was garbage. Because people didn't care. It was like things with edges had become unimportant, especially if you were just, because you didn't need a sword anymore. People were still using axes, but only hillbillies out in the woods. It didn't matter. Everything was in cities. You don't need knives and swords and axes in cities, and that was the market. So maybe you were selling chef's knives, but how many people do you know who actually have really shitty chef's knives? A lot of people have crappy chef's knives. They have no idea that they have crappy chef's knives. Right. Or they don't realize that their chef knife is incredibly dull. Like the number of, I'll go to people's houses and, you look at it edge on and you're like, I can see the edge of your knife. I shouldn't be able to see a reflection on the edge of your knife. Your knife is dull. They're like, oh no, it cuts fine. And I was like, no, it doesn't. You're like, can't you see that I'm like trying to cut these onions and it doesn't cut? But so that's one argument for why wootz went out, is utility. Like it had become such a niche thing that it was really being made just for ceremonial swords. Because the cost of it was relatively high. I've been told by Sikhs who know from their grandparents, etc., that to purchase a wootz sword, you were going to pay its weight in gold for that sword.
Wow.
Right. And that's obviously kind of coming from the end of the period when they were being made, and there was a tendency, it became a smaller and smaller market. There's a tendency for the prices to go up. At some point in time, they were, exactly. At some point in time, they were producing large volumes of probably, okay quality wootz blades. And those they would have had to have been cheaper. But the expectation was that you would, if you bought this blade, it would last you for your entire lifetime, and you would pass it down. And, this was a multi-generational purchase. And, so it being expensive didn't matter quite as much. Part of why people were willing to pay the money for it was there was expectation that it would
Right.
last practically forever.
The monetary
Another really
cost was
strong,
more across the generations of the family.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of one argument. Fell out of favor, just partly because it wasn't needed anymore, and
Sure.
there were cheaper alternatives available. It is pretty well established that the last places where wootz was really being manufactured, the ingots were being manufactured,
Sure.
was in India, and
Okay.
kind of going back to what we were talking about before. What did the British do? They wanted to control, the making of any finished products. They did not want you to be able to make finished products. So all of the industries in India that produced finished goods, um, finished durable goods, were pretty much stamped out. And so there's quite a bit of evidence that the British purposefully killed the last remnants of the wootz industry there. It could be that it was on its way out anyways. Hard to know at this
Sure.
point. And there is, sort of the reasons that the British gave are, at least to some degree, valid reasons, which is essentially wootz required that you use charcoal, and at least for what you put in the crucible, but also it used a huge amount of charcoal first to make the raw material, and then to fire the furnace for actually melting that.